Have you ever noticed something interesting about people who think deeply? Many of the most thoughtful, emotionally aware individuals often seem mentally tired. Not because they're doing too much physically, but because their mind rarely slows down. Their thoughts continue long after the moment has passed.
A conversation ends, yet hours later, they're still replaying it. Did I explain that clearly? Did they misunderstand what I meant? Should I have said something different? And sometimes the mind continues this process even when nothing is happening.
It might be late at night. The world is quiet. Everything seems fine. But inside the mind, a different story is unfolding. Questions begin appearing one after another. What if tomorrow doesn't go as planned? What if I made the wrong decision earlier? What if something unexpected happens? For many people, this pattern feels very familiar, and it creates an interesting psychological paradox. The same mental habit that makes someone thoughtful, careful, and empathetic can also become the thing that quietly drains their energy.
So, why does this happen? Why do some minds seem to analyze everything? To understand this, psychologists often talk about a pattern called rumination. Rumination happens when the mind repeatedly returns to the same thoughts.
Often these thoughts revolve around past experiences, uncertain situations, or social interactions. But here's something important to understand. People who overthink are not necessarily weak or overly anxious. In many cases, their minds are simply very active. They tend to analyze details more deeply. They notice patterns. They consider multiple possibilities before reaching a conclusion. In other words, their brain is constantly trying to understand the world around them. But sometimes this mental system becomes a little too active. A part of the brain that plays a major role in this process is the prefrontal cortex. This area helps us plan, reflect, and evaluate decisions. At the same time, another system in the brain, known as the default mode network, continues producing internal dialogue. This combination can create a mind that feels almost constantly active. It revisits the past, it analyzes the present, and it tries to predict the future.
But interestingly, this pattern often begins much earlier in life. For many people, the habit of overthinking develops during childhood. When someone grows up in an environment where emotions, expectations, or outcomes feel unpredictable, the brain adapts. It learns to stay alert. It begins asking questions like, what might happen next? How can I avoid making mistakes? What should I do to stay safe? From the brain's perspective, this strategy actually makes sense. If you think ahead and analyze situations carefully, you may feel more prepared for whatever comes next. In this way, overthinking can begin as a protective habit, a mind trying to anticipate problems before they appear. But psychologists also recognize that not all overthinking looks the same. Sometimes thinking deeply can be very helpful. For example, reflective thinking allows a person to understand their emotions, learn from experiences, and grow. This type of thinking can increase self-awareness and emotional intelligence. However, there is another pattern where the mind becomes stuck. Instead of moving toward solutions, it keeps circling the same worries again and again. This is where overthinking starts to create stress. Sleep becomes harder. Decisions feel heavier. And small situations can begin to feel much larger than they really are. The difficult part is that the mind often believes it is solving something. Psychologists sometimes describe this as an illusion of progress. There's also a biological reason why this can feel strangely addictive. Whenever the brain tries to analyze a problem, it releases small amounts of dopamine. Even imagined problem solving can trigger this response.
So when someone mentally replays conversations or analyzes possible outcomes, the brain may receive a tiny reward simply for the act of thinking. This is why telling someone to just stop thinking about it rarely works. Their brain has become used to the process. But there is another side to this story that often gets overlooked.
People who tend to think deeply are often very perceptive. Many of them have strong cognitive empathy. They notice subtle emotional signals. They pay attention to tone, body language, and atmosphere.
They often sense things that others might miss. In many ways, the same mental system that creates exhaustion also creates awareness. It allows people to understand others more deeply. But when perception is constant and resolution is unclear, it can become tiring. Because the truth is, not every situation in life can be solved through thinking alone. Some experiences need to be felt. Some decisions need to be made, even without perfect certainty. And some thoughts simply need to be allowed to pass. This is why many therapists focus not on eliminating thoughts completely, but on changing the way people respond to them. One helpful approach is acceptance and commitment therapy. This method encourages people to observe their thoughts without becoming trapped inside them. Instead of fighting every thought, they learn to recognize it and let it move on. Over time, this creates a little space between the mind and the thought itself. And that small space can make a big difference. Because in the end, overthinking is not a flaw. It is often the sign of a deeply active and perceptive mind. A mind that learned to stay alert in a world that once felt uncertain. The real challenge is not silencing that mind. The challenge is teaching it something new. That sometimes it's safe enough to rest.
And understanding that might be the first step toward finding a little more peace inside the mind.